Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to kick off a little bit early, so we can try and get you away to the drinking slightly earlier. On behalf of MIPIM and MIPIM, I should say, and also RICS, thank you, sorry, who are co-sponsoring this today, a very warm welcome to you to come and join us for what I hope will be 60 minutes of education and also an opportunity for debate on the very, very technical but also very important subject of dense cities, for better or for worse. And one of the interesting things in preparing for this is dense cities have their own problems, but as we're going to hear, they're also shrinking cities, and they pose different types of problems. So we're going to look at it from both ends. It's great for us at RICS to be party to this session, part of the RICS Vision for Cities programme of research and debate on all things that are urban. And as RICS is a global professional body acting in the public interest, we see it as our responsibility to address matters of significance in relation to land, property, and the construction and built environment. And so we've been commissioning research for many years and promoting debate, not just within our own membership around the world, but obviously engaging specifically with others who have specialist knowledge and research. Thought leaders in their area, some of whom, or all of whom here, are specialists. I don't want to dwell too long on the question of urbanisation from my point of view, because I'm just the moderator, but it is interesting to look back and look at the statistics of urbanisation. In 1800, only about 3% of the world's population lived in urban areas. By 1900, it was about 14%, although there were only 12 cities at that time with more than 1 million inhabitants. And by 1950, this had reached 30%. And there are now over 400 cities with a population of over 1 million, 19 of which are over 10 million. So what does this sort of massive explosion of urbanisation mean for communities and businesses, economies, and specifically our environment? And what are the risks and rewards of this massive move towards dense development? Now, as I said, we are very fortunate today to have a truly international panel of speakers. Hopefully we'll stimulate the debate on this subject and the pros and cons of dense cities. I was at a session this morning on investment in China, and the subject came up of the fact that they have to cater for something between 18 and 20 million people leaving the countryside every year. Now being directed more to second and third tier cities than the major conurbations. And they have a real issue associated with urban development. And it's interesting, of course, the other aspect of this is that most of these people are actually going to existing cities, imposing some real stresses and strains on the infrastructures of those cities, some of which were built many years ago. So each speaker is going to be talking for 8 to 10 minutes, and our first speaker is Tom Lloyd-Jones. Tom is Tony, I'll get it right, thank you very much. Tony is Reader in International Planning and Sustainability Development at the University of Westminster in London, and before that he practiced internationally for many years as an architect, urban designer and planner, including working as a community architect in London throughout the 1980s. And he spent 6 years as an advisor to the UK government's Department for International Development and is a member of the RICS Disaster Management Commission. Over to you, Tony.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Density, as a planner, density is my favourite subject, so I could speak for the whole 60 minutes, but I've only got 10 minutes. So I've squeezed my talk into, basically I'm talking about density not as buildings but as people, because I think that's the most important thing. So I'm not going to talk about this first slide. It's just to introduce. What I'm going to do is pick up on Robert's discussion about, or introduction to the subject of urbanization. He talked about what's happened in the past. We also need to look at what's happening now and what's happening in the future. At this moment in time, about 50% of the world's population lives in cities. The area in blue at the bottom is the rural population, was expected to peak soon and fall back. The area in pink is the population in high-income countries in cities. The area in green is the population in what are called middle-income countries, low and upper middle-income countries. And it's already the majority of the population in the world. And in 40 years' time, that is going to double. So effectively, all of the increase in population in the next 40 years is going to be in cities in what's called the middle-income countries. And that's anything from $1,000 per capita to $12,500 per capita. These countries are also growing very fast. Their average growth rate last year was 6%. Where are they? Well, if we look at the megacities, the 10 million, there's a huge concentration in East Asia, as we would expect, Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in Latin America, and some in Europe and North America, and a number emerging in the Middle East and in Africa. What I'm mostly interested in, what does this mean for housing? At this moment in time, the majority of people are people who are occupying land without going through a formal market process. So it's really only of interest to people who are into buying land, but buying land in developing countries is a very hazardous process. Or a small amount that's being built by governments, very little. What we're really interested in, I'm sorry, my slide has slipped, but the two strands in the middle are what the Chinese would call commodity housing. That is land subdivisions and multifamily developer-led development. What we're looking at really is the 2.5 billion who are going to be housed in that middle column there. And most important thing is, my slide has slipped, I'm afraid, but you'll have to imagine that the numbers link up with the arrows. A big increase in the commodity housing. So what do we mean by density, housing density? Well, it ranges from less than 30 people per hectare in low suburban densities to slum densities of up to 1,500 or 3,500 people per hectare. So what does 3,500 people per hectare look like? It looks like this. Nothing to do with high-rise. It's a slum in Mumbai. And it's lots of people crammed into small one-room shacks with hardly any streets. And if you want to know what the greatest density that anywhere has probably been, is this now demolished development in Kowloon, which had up to 12,500 people per hectare in essentially 10 to 11-story slums. So that's where what's the maximum we could expect to get to, but fortunately we're not heading in that direction. In terms of urban densities, the variation is much less, from 3,000 people per square kilometre in Los Angeles to 40,000 in Manila. But really what I wanted to concentrate on was the issue of sprawl, because still it's the case that most people buy land or occupy land on the edge of city. That's how cities grow. And the result is a huge growth in suburban development. And what we're going to see is the same process that's happened particularly in North America, Australia, to some certain extent in Europe, is going to happen across the world. And the question, is sprawl the enemy of sustainability? As a planner, I think I would probably say yes, but maybe we could say yes with some reservations. If that's the case, what are we going to be able to do about it? If it's the enemy of sustainability, it's a lot to do with energy and fuel use, and this is quite a famous graph that shows the density of cities against the amount of fuel use per annum, and it divides fairly neatly into these clusters in America, Australia and Canada, Europe and Asia. And if we look at the price of oil, this is the price with the price with not the actual price, but the price at 2009 prices. We're also heading up now to the levels that we reached in the 1970 oil crisis. And the amount of fuel we use obviously rises with the income levels. And the graph on the bottom left shows how car ownership also increases very dramatically so that's where the middle income countries are, and that's where they're headed. So my argument really is that the pressures are on now, just from the cost of fuel, for us to look towards densifying our cities, particularly the suburban areas. And how do we do that? Well, we need to make our much greater reliance on public transport, and that requires higher density to make it feasible. And the example I wanted to show was Melbourne, where the average density in the suburbs is about 30 people per hectare, and they have a new plan which involves building dense corridors along the main bus routes and tram routes, anything up to 600 people per hectare. So quite a dramatic increase in density, but that can be achieved by building anything up to 8 stories, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories. It doesn't require high rise. So what can we say? That the future suburbia is probably unavoidable, but what we really need to do is make new public transport links and densify in the most accessible locations. This is nothing new, I'm saying. This is the kind of mantra that you'll hear from planners. We've been saying for a number of years now, and we're going to have to say it much louder, because I think the challenges are really upon us. In America, it's called smart growth or new urbanism. In Europe, we tend to refer to it as urban villages or compact cities, and we've seen the example of Melbourne. Obviously, there's a lot more to cities than suburbs. We've got the dense core that we have to deal with, and I think I can probably leave my colleagues to say a little bit more about that, much as I would love to talk about it now. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tony. Just as some housekeeping, I forgot to mention at the beginning, if people haven't switched their mobiles and BlackBerries off, could they do so? And secondly, filming is not permitted during this session. Pictures are. I forgot to mention that right at the beginning. My apologies. Tony, to follow you, our next speaker is Mr. Ong Si Liang, who is RICS President-elect, and therefore will follow me as Global President in July. Mr. Ong is an executive director of Davis Langdon and Sierra in Malaysia and a board member of Davis Langdon and Sierra International. And he's spent more than 35 years of experience, or has more than 35 years of experience in the public and private sectors in the construction industry. And he's a member of many of the institutions in Malaysia, which I'm not going to run into in detail. Lian, it's yours.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to not to repeat what Tony have shared with you, although the number of slides that he presented was somewhat. I think this is one of the slides that we will talk about the growth in terms of mega cities around the globe. We will see that we have more than 200 cities, which is more than 1 million people, and currently close to 20 cities, which are more than 10 million. And by the turn of the, in about 2-3 years' time, we'll probably see this number will double up. In Africa alone, there were 2 cities in 1950 that has a population of 1 million, but in 2040, it has been predicted that will grow up to 80 cities. And so that is quite a phenomenal growth as we look at the challenges before us. In terms of the population growth, we find that currently about 45 or 50% are urbanized, but by 2020, perhaps this number will grow to about 65%. And some of the emerging regions are urbanizing the fastest, particularly in Africa, India, and China, and Latin America. And you can see that the growth of urbanization it is at a very phenomenal rate, and these are in some of the poorest countries as well. These slides will present the 10 largest cities by population density. You see that all these cities are from Asia, Africa, and Latin America as well. And you find that the combined population of Mumbai and New Delhi will be about 50 million, which is, by comparison, the whole of the population of UK is only 65 million, and that is a phenomenal growth. This is Chongqing City. We talked a lot about it this morning in the other session. It's called the Manhattan of China. It has a population of 32 million. And somewhat it's difficult to define how dense this is because the territory or the boundary of the city keep on growing, as we heard this morning. And in China and elsewhere, we find that the increase in urbanization are no longer due to the natural growth, but many of these are because of the migration from the rural area to the urban area in search of employment and better opportunities and better quality of life. And some of these cities, you see that their demographic changes as well as the lifespan of people and the healthcare improves. Definitely there is also a change in terms of the needs of the cities. What are the critical issues facing the cities? Basically, people in search of housing, accommodation, and these are critical issues, and I think Tony has already highlighted it very eminently just now on the need for housing and how you can put it. These are some of the images that would show us how desperate it is. Like this is in Hong Kong, and this situation is still prevalent where poor people do not have a house, they just have a cage to call them, this is their home. I will just move on very quickly in some of the key elements that we have to look at in terms of planning. I'm not here I know that most of the audience here are learned people, but critical to us is that we must have a strong policy and strategy in urban planning. We need the like of Singapore government, which has got very strong regulation and very determined in terms of provide facilities and continuously modernizing the requirements. So you need strong government support in some of this area. And you know that world-class urban cities will need to connect not just within the region, but also with the other parts of the world. Therefore, the need for linkages, for communication are also important. Law enforcement are important as well. You need to have an environment where you can enforce and you can find compliance with regulations. You need to have communicative planning and how communities will relate to one another, especially in the multiracial, multicultural environment like in Singapore, in Hong Kong, where you need the people from different backgrounds to interact and to communicate with one another. The other is on land use planning, on housing, which is a major needs of any densities. You need for a place for people to work, industrial, and for people to do business, the commercial development, for institutions, government, schools, etc., and also obviously a place for people to relax and to recreate and to spend their leisure time. In terms of space planning in particular, you need to take into consideration, and I think Tony put forward an argument whether we should go for a denser city or for a sprawl city like Melbourne, or we should have a more compact city. This is an argument that we can debate in this forum. In urban design, we need to think about mobility of people from their home to their place of work, and also how they can commute easily from one place to another. I just want to, within the next few minutes, just talk a little bit about Hong Kong. Hong Kong, although by density per the area is not that dense, but just because only 25% of the land mass is available for building, and you can see that that has really resulted in a challenge for planners like Hong Kong, with a population of 7 million, and in about a few years' time touching 8 million, and you can see that some of the challenges they face. And Hong Kong has also inherited a lot of old buildings, and regeneration is a major challenge in this island state. And you can also see that the needs of the people coming from different backgrounds and the plurality of the people certainly will bring lots of challenges to the city planners. Obviously, in the urban planning, they would need to look at issues like housing, issues pertaining to education, a place to do business, and the urban transportation. And I can say that over the last 15 years, the planners in Hong Kong has taken this into consideration, and they have developed a very good infrastructure network with the MRT and also rail lines and also highways, which will enable the city to modernize without having an impact on the environment. And some of the issues affecting Hong Kong particularly will be in terms of the urban growth, how they can limit the growth, and how they could conserve the existing building. And one of the problems they face when they knocked down the Star Ferry terminal in central area has invited a great challenge from the communities, where a great property of heritage value was leveled to the ground, and this has caused a lot of complaints from the residents. Transportation planning and management is again another issue, whether we should consider road pricing in some of the city center like Singapore, or like Singapore and Shanghai now, where you try to limit the number of private vehicles by imposing a tax on car ownership. So these are some of the challenges that planners will have to consider when they plan for dense cities. The role of urban design and planning professionals will have to consider some of the creative ideas in terms of planning the use of space, for example, below some of the these highways, and also below the interchanges, that can create a pleasant environment for people to interact with one another. One of the other issues that we are now facing, how do we create a green and sustainable environment? How can we reduce the heat island effect? These are all issues that will dawn upon us when we plan for densities. The lack of open and recreational and communal space, for example, would somehow create some antisocial environment, especially in the Asian context, where people tend to pay a lot of attention to family, and they would like to have space where a family can get together and have a time where they can relax in the environment that is pleasant. This also brings us to another issue, whether we should have a trust fund, for example, to deal with how we can reduce carbon in some of the developments. Can we impose carbon pricing in the development that we have, something like what the UK is now considering? Some of the specific factors in planning for densities are like accessibility, issues like linkages, and creating a signpost or orientation where people can relate. You don't want to be lost in the midst of concrete jungles. You want to have places where you can interact and relate to. So I would not labor on that, but just to finish off with some of the things that RICS is currently doing, some of which I think Robert has already touched on. We now have over 150,000 members in about 140 countries. About more than 90,000 are qualified members, and out of this, 40,000 of members are involved in matters pertaining to planning and development. And so we have, as Robert said, we are taking in leadership role in many of these areas. We have done research on green infrastructure, on planning viability, how to create models for affordable housing, and models for PPPs and PFIs. So with that, I thank you.
Andres Schmanski, who is now going to speak to you for the next 10 minutes. Dr. Scharmanski holds a PhD in economics and political science from the University of Cologne, and his scientific work has concentrated on the internationalization of the real estate sector with an emphasis on the development of office markets in the emerging countries. And since 2009, he has been project manager at the German Federal Institute for Research on Building, Urban Affairs and Spatial Development, which he's currently in charge of several research projects, focusing particularly on the demographic and structural changes and their impact on cities and development. So I think you're going to be concentrating on that.
Thank you. As we already heard, about or more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities, but the 20th century was not only a period of urban growth, but also of shrinkage. More than 450 large cities have been experienced declines in population, mainly in the old industrialized countries, and since the 90s in the former Eastern Bloc countries. But what processes lie behind shrinkage? The symptom of shrinking cities is based on a heterogeneous variety of causes that can differ fundamentally from place to place. First, the destruction by wars or natural disasters. Second, the loss of resources like minerals or water. Third, the spatial shifting of economic activity or residence, for example, the suburbanization process. And finally, long-term changes of demographic and economic conditions can have massive effects on the development of cities and regions. If we consider Europe, it's mainly a combination of spatial shifting, demographic and economic changes that have led to problematic regional development paths. Today, the main European sites of shrinking cities are post-socialist countries, structurally weak regions like the southern part of Italy, the Mezzogiorno, and old industrialized regions like the rural area in Germany or the northern part of Spain. Let's have a closer look at the situation in Germany. According to our new population forecast, by 2025, the population in West German regions will decline by more than 10%, while the population in East German regions will be declined by a less dramatic 3% in this time period. But decline is no longer a singular problem of the eastern parts of Germany. The number of districts with a declining population continues to increase. As you can see on the right-hand side, between 2010 and 2025, almost 85% of all 440 existing districts in Germany will experience a decline in population. The next figure shows selected cities with high relative losses of population in Germany. Due to outmigration and decreasing birth rates, some cities like Halle or Schwerin lost about 30% of their residents in just 2 decades. Whereas in the first half of the 90s, the migration within Germany to the old federal states was responsible for this development. And the second half of the 90s, the cause or the main cause was the suburbanization process. So this brings up the question, what consequences demographic decline can possibly have for the housing markets in Germany? As the demographer David Foote puts it, 2/3 of everything can be explained by demographics. This is also true for the housing markets in Germany. The uneven development across Germany poses high risks in regions that are losing population and households. Risks of vacancy, or the expected risk of vacancy, will be especially high in some market segments, like in the apartment building sector, and especially high in the eastern parts of Germany. Analog to the demographic change, the demand for new housing or the demand for apartment buildings will be declining. High demand is only expected for some cities, big cities like Munich, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Berlin, and for established industrial regions like the Ruhr area or Saarland and North Bavaria, Eastern Bavaria, and Lower Saxony, there's no demand for new construction in the apartment segment. This applies also to all regions in the eastern parts of Germany. There's no need for new construction in this sector until 2025, with the exception of Berlin and Dresden. So my conclusions. Shrinking is a global phenomenon. In coming decades, we will see many shrinking cities, recovering from shrinkage, cities that might disappear altogether, and within cities, a combination of all these outcomes. What are the consequences of shrinkage? They are diverse. For example, perforated urban structures for the real estate markets, high vacancy rates, reducing values of properties, abandoned and blighted properties, an overcapacity of infrastructure, fiscal strains, and social segregation. So the shrinking cities are facing big challenges. And what are the ideal or what are viable options for these shrinking cities? For example, is it redevelopment, historic preservation, temporary uses, demolition, or perhaps something else? And what are the models, the key models for reconfiguring the urban structure in response to persistent population decline? Should the development be constrained to urban islands or certain nodes in the city as a way of maintaining density and vitality of the city? Or should dispersed vacancy be used to reduce the overall density of a city? And what are the policy options? For example, the German federal government has created 2001 the so-called Stadtumbau Ost, urban restructuring in the new federal states, to deal with this shrinkage process. The focus of this program is on demolition of vacant housing units and on revitalization measures. In scope of this program, about 300,000 housing units have been torn down in new federal states, and the vacancy rates therefore decrease from more than 16% to less than 10%. Finally, we cannot be certain what the future holds for cities that experience dramatic and persistent decline, but public authorities as well, and at the national as well as at the local level can play a key role in exploring alternatives to stabilize transitional cities and neighborhoods and point the way to a more sustainable future. Thank you very much.
I think it's quite interesting, Andre, that to put front an audience that's talking about dense cities, or came here to talk about dense cities, actually we've got some serious problems, certainly in Germany, but there are other countries with falling populations. Perhaps an improved immigration policy in Germany might assist you. Our final 10-minute contribution is from Dr. Fouad Bendimerad, and he's an executive director of, this will go well, Earthquakes and Megacities Initiative based in Manila. So another issue, earthquakes, which is very much on the agenda. EMI is an international not-for-profit scientific organization dedicated to the reduction of disaster risk in major cities. I think it was founded in 1998, Fouad, something like that, in response to an urgent need to stimulate urban earthquake preparedness and mitigation in developing countries. And you act, I think, as a catalyst for scientific delivery of scientific and technical knowledge in that basis. And you've worked closely with the RICS Disaster Management Commission. I'm absolutely fascinated because I think it's quite challenging to work out how a city can prepare itself at the end of the day for a massive earthquake that might take place underneath. They're pretty well-known structures that would resist some of the forces that can be unleashed by nature, but I'm waiting with interest.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you and good afternoon. Well, title of my short and brief presentation in Megacities, Mega Risk Challenges and Opportunities. And when I talk about risk, I'm not talking about risk to investment, but as it was specified, risk from natural disaster, including climate change. Okay, so why are we concerned about that is just the cost of disasters have increased significantly in the last 2 decades. For example, the number of people affected has doubled between the last 2 decades. And the average cost has increased sixfold in the last 30 years and could reach about $300 billion per year in average by 2030. Same thing, economic loss in the 90s was about 200 times more than in the 50s. So this, of course, concerns a lot in terms of government, but also in terms of investors in general. And the trend keeps increasing. As a matter of fact, in its UN Global Assessment Report, the General Secretary of the UN listed 3 causes of human vulnerability that threaten humanity in the future. First one was urban governance and urban risk. And the second one was climate change, and the third one was protecting rural livelihoods. And as a result, the UN has launched last year, a campaign, a cities campaign called Resilient Cities campaign for the next 5 years. And now I was asked to look at one particular case, which is the case of Istanbul, and to illustrate to you about what one major city around the world is doing about its earthquake threat and turning the liability into assets. Istanbul is threatened by this collision of plates, tectonic plates. There are actually 4 tectonic plates that come together around Turkey, and you could point out to that city of Istanbul where it is indicated in red somehow in the upper left portion of the slide. And this NAFZ, which is a North Anatolian fault zone, is this mighty, big earthquake fault that generate major earthquakes in that part of the world. So to illustrate to you, here's Istanbul. Please locate it there, just where the Bosphorus is between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. And I'm showing you the sequence of the earthquakes in the last century. And I think it will become obvious to you what happened. So in 1912, there was this earthquake just west of Istanbul. Those are major earthquakes of magnitude 7 and above, just create really a lot of damage should they happen in a city. And then if you go back now to the complete east part of Turkey, then you have this Erzincan earthquake, which was a huge earthquake, 7.8 magnitude earthquake. And you see how the sequencing goes along 1942, and then 1943, 1944, 1951, 1957, 1967, and then way back again, 1992, and then the major 2 earthquakes in 1999 called the Marmara earthquake, and then nothing has happened around Istanbul. So obviously that for any layman person, not even, you don't need to be a seismologist to figure out something is going to happen. So that makes the odds, scientifically you can calculate that, it makes the odds of a big earthquake happening in Istanbul in the next 30 years better than not happening. Meaning there's about 60 to 65% chance there will be an earthquake of magnitude 7.5 or greater in Istanbul in the next 30 years, meaning during our lifetime. So for those who are investing there, you should maybe consider this. This is not unique to Istanbul. 8 of 10 major cities around the world are, threatened by earthquakes. Yeah. So it just naturally, if they're not threatened by earthquakes, they have other issues such as coastal erosion and other problems. So risk is part of life now. So what do you do about it? Okay. So the density is a big issue. All the issues that were raised earlier by the previous speaker, of course, the migration, and just issues like this really is what the vulnerability comes, and how the losses just, kind of add up. Okay, so in about 10 years ago, just after the Marmara earthquake, the Metropolitan Municipality of Istanbul launched this project called the Earthquake Master Plan. And in the master plan, it's a scientific approach essentially to say what are the options from all sides of the options, from the legal aspect all the way to, preparing populations, to land use planning, to all that are available to reduce risk in the long term. So they developed this plan, which has actually served the city quite well and really has turned aspect of liability in terms of and becoming challenges and into things. One of them is, and what's been proposed, is to look at urban redevelopment as a means to reduce risk and at the same time improve the economic and living conditions of those neighborhoods. This is one particular neighborhood called Zeytinburnu, which is really center to Istanbul, and there was a huge, major project to see how can this be developed in such a way as to reduce risk, while at the same time, improving the capability, economic potential of the neighborhood. So you can see what that being proposed. I don't have the time to go through the detail of it, but it is on a web, site, and part of it, of course, is completely new investment. and including denser housing, demolishing what has been, all is what's brown and red there, it means it's highly vulnerable, and then replacing it by denser things, which again, better infrastructure in terms of access, in terms of open space, but higher density in terms of housing. That led to other type of project within Istanbul. One of them is the old city of Istanbul, Fatih, which is the oldest neighborhood. And those neighborhoods have a lot of potential because they attract a lot of tourists, of course, but the housing is old. And so this approach to redevelop with the idea of reducing the risk is very attractive. Okay, and this is another neighborhood within Istanbul. So this transformation, urban transformation project, are major projects that are dealing with the issue of how do you combine future growth, how do you combine future development with the notion of reducing risk. Okay, this notion really has launched this notion of, we used to talk about sustainable cities, now the notion is to talk about resilient cities. Resilient cities means you add one component to it. You have this urban sustainability and urban livability, but then you introduce into it disaster resiliency, meaning whether it's climate change or it's earthquakes or it's flooding or some other type of disasters, you incorporate this aspect within your planning processes. And planners get trained to do this, and they're doing it in some cities. And it really opens up a door for dealing with this neighborhood, which otherwise would be extremely difficult to bring within the formal development process. It's also opened up the door for public-private partnerships. But in those cases, really in some of those cases, the government has to come in first and invest to create the infrastructure and the viability for the private sector to come in. Okay, another example I want to show you very quickly. This is a very poor neighborhood within Metro Manila, where we supported the city to look at this notion of urban innovation and urban redevelopment through the context of this resiliency. And this poor neighborhood is really stuck between a freeway, a creek over there. It's highly dense, extremely dense, and but it blocks the city's development. It really is a pocket of poverty that really enables, very few opportunities for development for the city. This is Makati City, which is the richest city in the Philippines, which has the potential to develop, but has all this pocket of poverty that really, limits how much development can take place. And in this context, you could put a proposal for essentially changing the risk and using the approach. Like in this case, there's an earthquake fault that goes in. This is a green light. So it's proposed to create a fault zone development, where it's an open space essentially for new markets, open markets, for also drainage to serve against flood risk, which happens all the time. But it also opens up opportunities for linking this particular neighborhood to other development areas within the city. So in concluding comment, risk is not, and earthquake risk and other risks are not really necessarily a liability. If taken in the context of urban redevelopment and sustainability and resiliency, they can actually create the feasibility for development. Policymakers like the notion of sustainability, but sometimes they can do very little about it, especially in terms of poor neighborhoods. But the notion of resiliency is more attractive to them, and it's also more attractive to the population, to the communities themselves. They can associate with it much better than the notion of sustainability, because it touches them in their day-to-day, kind of risk, day-to-day livelihoods. And that they can make compromises and work much better in public-private partnerships and make this policy much more feasible to do. And it presents really good opportunities to kind of open up and increase and scale up the investment in terms of urban cities. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we'll have more discussions during later. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Well, we tried to give you a very wide range of viewpoints here on resilience. I've written down sustainability versus resilience. Which one's going to be the winner? Fouad, which one's going to be the winner going forward? Before you answer that question, I'll just give you an anecdote. My first visit to San Francisco in 1975, I was really puzzled by how people could live on the San Andreas Fault. And the story given to me by a colleague there I was visiting, that when the Transamerica Corporation building was being topped out, for those people who don't know, it was the pyramid building in the center of downtown San Francisco. The president of the Transamerican Corporation was doing the top-out ceremony, was asked, you realize now, Mr. President, you own the tallest building in San Francisco. Oh, gee, I guess I do. And he said, what happened when the big earthquake comes? And his answer was, well, I guess I'll own the longest building in San Francisco. And, in a sort of way, one has to be fatalistic about that. But I mean, what is the most important agenda here? We've got a green agenda, we talk about sustainability, we talk about density, going to come on to what is good density. And you've introduced a new concept. How many people in the room have used the concept of resilience in relation to development? Cities. So you heard it here first, and maybe that argument between resilience and a different word may be interesting. So which is the winner here? Sustainability, or
sustainability resiliency does not exclude sustainability. It just adds another component to it. Essentially, what planners are looking for in terms of is how can you develop in a sustainable way, but also in terms of reducing your risk from natural disaster and others. Mm-hmm. So it just adds another set of parameters that you have to incorporate into your planning processes. So I believe the resiliency will win. But it's just taking over everywhere now in terms of this.
One of the ways of dealing with earthquake risk is dispersal, not concentration.
Well, not really, because contrary to popular belief, big high-rise buildings are actually extremely good for earthquakes. They almost don't feel the earthquake. If you look at earthquake damage, except for few exceptions like Mexico City, it's buildings between 4, 5 stories, 6 story. Those are the ones that really get things. The high-rise buildings have a lot of inertia. They're designed for very high wind, and they're just not going to feel the earthquake. It's just that their periods and their frequencies are so much farther away from the earthquake frequencies. People don't know that.
Well, that introduces another interesting issue, quite unexpectedly, that mid-rise, as opposed to high-rise developments, and certainly one's seeing, not so much in the Eastern world, but certainly in the Western world, where we're redeveloping, we're going for 4 to 8 story blocks, and they are more dangerous. So, look, they're more dangerous, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I mean, for most earthquakes, they will be more dangerous because the frequency is very close to the typical frequency, natural frequency of earthquakes. So there is an amplification of the, response.
Okay, so just extending that, Andre, I'll come back to you in a minute about shrinking cities and her. Well, actually, can I link the two together? You mentioned about centers of urbanism. It doesn't have to be in one big mass of dense city. Actually, centers of denseness might be a better way forward in dealing with this. Have I got you correctly here? And if you could answer that one, I can link it in, Andre, because one of the things that you are looking at is, and the German authorities are looking at, is in a shrinking city, actually just take whole neighborhoods out and flatten them. Which requires some fairly good social engineering, because you've got to move people from the fewer people in this area and dense them over here. So just as first with you, Tony.
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
The question is do you think that centers of urban concentration are connected, obviously, with infrastructure connections, are a better bet in dense cities than really just coming into one massive space, one massive area?
Yes, because I think people, on the whole, like to live in suburban areas, and if they're going to be sustainable, then they really need to have public transport. And to make public transport sustainable, you need to have some clustering of density around the lines of infrastructure. So yes, I'm a firm believer in this approach.
Linked to that question, and in question of Lian, we talked about planning and the planning aspects of that. I mean, just take it to my own home city of of London. Do you think that actually the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, should be put in charge of the whole of the southeast of England? Would that actually, it's a facetious question, but I mean, the boundary of the urban authority is a crucial issue, is it not here, Tony?
Yes, indeed, and it's always a challenge. Planners love city regions, but politicians unfortunately prefer to have smaller units to deal with. So I think we have to be realistic. Yes, I would like to see planning at a much larger regional scale, but I think there's political resistance is always going to exist. In some parts of the world, they do have metropolitan planning. In China, it's almost totally de rigueur, but not in the UK.
Maybe that's why China is urbanizing so successfully so quickly, because it does have big urban authorities. And is that a lesson that we can learn in the West?
Yes, I'd like to see that happening. We have some experiments. Paris has a metropolitan planning region and has more successfully planned around transport. But London, in a way, cities develop naturally along their transport routes anyway. So a lot of what we say should happen in planning already happens as a result of the normal property value pressures.
Well, certainly my view is that you need to have strong leadership, whether at policy making level or even at the planning professionals, among professionals as well. You need to have strong leadership in leading what is best for taking into consideration all factors, including now we talk about urban resiliency as well, particularly in earthquake or disaster prone areas, not necessarily for earthquake, but also flood prone areas like, in some of the low-lying cities. How do you deal with floodings, like Bangladesh, in Dhaka, for example? Every monsoon you face flood. How do you deal with that kind of situation? And then the losses incurred, and not only loss of life, loss of property, loss of opportunities. I think these are issues that has to be widely considered. I take the view of Tony that, to plan for infrastructure, you need to have to create that kind of economy of scale. You need to have planned, concentrated areas where you can maximize the value of the investment on those infrastructure.
Andre, just going back to your problem in Germany, I was actually staggered by this. I don't know if the audience was staggered by the sheer scale of the problem that now seems to be facing Germany on demographic decline over the next 30 or 40 years. But just going specifically to the experience of the German authorities in dealing with shrinking cities, what is the prevalent attitude? Are they adopting a position of wholesale flattening of areas and population movement into create denser village areas, or have they got different type of policies?
So I think the vision of the federal government is to create the European compact city with an attractive urban center. Is it on?
Yes, just
okay.
Loud, yeah.
With reduced land consumption and a stable population. But I described the one model which calls the urban islands to constrain the new developments to certain islands, but it is in practice is very very hard to implement this and to convince the people to turn down their houses, they lost their neighborhoods and their social environment. And but one thing is shrinking city planning in Germany often means attempts to make the cities greener, to reuse the brownfield sites, because there is no new need for new housing or new construction, and more compact for example, by reuse the brownfield sites for 1 and 2 housing, 2 house buildings. There is a greater demand. I have shown the demand for apartment buildings.
Yeah.
It's another story in the 1 and 2 family
So actually,
houses.
the solution for you
Yeah.
is to compact this thing, but also to de-densify it and go
Yeah.
down to low-density housing
Yeah.
as a means. So therefore, actually, people will be rather happier. I don't know if any of you guys, in your experience, has done any surveys on happiness factors in living in cities, and happiness factors in high-rise, mid-rise, and low-rise. Are anybody in the audience had any experience of happiness factors in cities? It was interesting. I've never seen any, but sometimes we might like to. Yes, gentlemen. Could you just identify who you are and where you're coming from? It should be on.
Alexander Bosak. Now, my name is Alexander Bosak. I'm from Vienna and have my own consultancy business. But this was 10 years ago. I was working for an Austrian developer who had a contract with the city of Vienna to refurbish this. In German, it's this Plattenbauten, Siedlungen. Prefabricated social housings, and with total. So one was with inhabitants of 8,000 and one with 4,000 inhabitants, and I was studying sociology at the time, and I was doing cluster analysis and everything, and I found out first of all that until 20 people living in one house, they are happy. And when there were 70 people, and this was in that respect for housing high-rise buildings, they were not so happy. They didn't like and you see it also in the vandalism in the entrance area. This was much more vandalized the high-rise buildings than in comparison the smaller ones where they had more control over it, and also the communication in between the function was better.
But it's interesting. I mean, you could do that study with different nationalities and come up with slightly different answers.
Yes, no, but
it's about people's personal space requirements.
No. But what was also interesting is these were from the educational level. This was on the lower level. Let's say it was, and there were also studies in Germany from the 50s when they were starting these high-rise buildings and the education was high. So this is also an intermediary parameter that they liked it. So because you also have to rationalize more if you are in a high-rise building, so you have to understand it better. But it was interesting to find out that the better functional complexes in this.
I think the problem we've got here, and we're running out of time, but the problem we've got here is that the urbanization is going so fast, particularly in the developing countries, that the rather sort of Western liberal notion that you could actually ask people what they want to live in is not something that is necessarily capable of being asked because of the speed with which things have been done. We just have to do this one way or another. Sorry, I'm just going to move on. Before we close, is anybody else has got a burning issue there? Gentleman with a moustache.
Thank you. My name is Ismael Fernandez. I'm from Mexico. I have a couple of points that I want to make. First one is, as you just said, the speed of the development. It was said here that there's going to be 2 billion inhabitants in the next 40 years. That means that the world have to build about 500 million homes in this time. And one of the best programs of housing is the one that we have in Mexico, which we are building somewhere around 1 million houses per year. That means that we need more or less 400 years to build all those houses. So this is important to understand it. The second one is the point that you were making about the happiness factor. When we're talking about density, I don't think that we have to go into numbers in the sense of this number of people per hectare. But really what we need to know is the perceived space of that person. So I think that the density, the limit of the density should be the perceived space, because physically you can stand up in 1 square meter by 2 meters and that's enough for you. But the perceived space is terrible. And that generates, of course, what has just been said, a lot of vandalism and problems. This was shown very clearly in that famous film, Clockwork Orange. Precisely the point of the size of the space where these persons were living. So if you propose a house of 30 square meters for a family of 5, I'm sure that's going to be vandalism there. So we have to go into that point very, very, very closely. And then to the third point, that the urban sustainability, urban livability, and resilience, that's exactly the 3 main issues that have to be considered in this future development. Because if you start to build one house next to the other, and you go to the 500 million, then you are not going to build a city. You are going to build houses. And that's not the answer for the problem that we have. We need to build spaces for the livability of people. Thank you very much.
I mean, what better way than summing it up than that? So we've run out of time, but thank you very much for your patience. But a few things that come out of that. Research on perceived space, and do planners and architects actually understand that? Would be an interesting further piece of work, because that helps to design things differently for different parts of the world. I could link that to the happiness factor, I suppose, is a rather sort of layman's way of putting it. And the link between resilience and sustainability is another factor that's come out of this conversation. So I hope you found it interesting, and thanks very much to the panelists and speakers for their contribution today. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.